Well, good morning, everyone. I'm just waiting to make sure this is working. It is working. Excellent. Good morning. I hope you're all well and enjoying Melbourne's very summery weather this year. It's a little bit one out of the box. My name is Dwayne, and I'm the husband of the wonderful Kath and the dad of Hannah. And I haven't spoken in church for a while, so I'm a bit nervous and a bit rusty. And please feel free to stop me if I start speaking heresy. Preparing for this talk, actually, I realised that I'd missed my 40th birthday. Now, I don't look like day over 35, I know, but in 1983, I became a follower of Jesus and was spiritually born. Now, many times in those 40 years, which is a biblical number, meaning a very long time. Israel was 40 years in the desert. Jesus was 40 days in the wilderness. Noah and his ark were 40 days on the water, and many other examples. So many times the promises of God were put to the test, including the time of my deepest spiritual valley, which I'll describe a bit later. Now, this month, we've been looking at some of the promises of God and how and why they are important. And promises are important. If they're kept, they speak to the integrity and to the reliability of the promiser, giving an indication of the person's trustworthiness, as they do if they are not kept. Some people don't like making promises because there's a responsibility attached. If I can, I'll see. And unless a better offer comes up, that one's not said out loud, but it's implied, are the outs we might use. Politicians especially avoid making promises they might not be able to keep. Our promises bind us to a desired outcome, which may or may not eventuate. God's promises, in contrast, are guaranteed. But promises are also things that bind us together. Who doesn't love a wedding? We attended one a couple of weeks ago, the beautiful bride, the groom weeping with joy. No, it was joy. Signing the register and the party afterwards. But the most significant part of the ceremony are the commitments, the promises of the couple. They are promising, I will never leave you nor forsake you. The same kind of promise that we will be focused on today. So to the passage from Hebrews. We don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews, or exactly who it was written to, or even why. We can deduce a few things. The structure and language indicate it wasn't the Apostle Paul, whose ministry was to the Gentiles anyway. The recipients were most likely Jewish believers in Rome who were intimately familiar with Jewish ceremony, including temple rites. The fact that the destruction of the temple is not mentioned would date the book before 70 CE, when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. The reason for the writing seems to be related to the persecution by Rome of Christians who were not a recognised religion like Judaism was. It was getting tough for the recipients to resist the pressure to return to Judaism, and they needed to be reminded that Jesus fulfilled the promises of the ceremonies and religion they had come from. The general structure that is repeated throughout the book is, this is the principle, this is what happened in the past, these are examples of that, but Jesus fulfilled or surpassed them, so don't go back. This is the format repeated throughout Hebrews, with chapters 11 and 12 on faith being a clear example. In chapter 11, faith is defined and a multitude of witnesses are listed as examples. Therefore, we are exhorted to run with perseverance the race marked out before us, because Jesus is the pioneer and perfecter of faith. Why did the readers need to be reminded of these things and to persevere? Because they were experiencing challenges that seemed too big for them. It seems that some had separated themselves from the congregation, as some are in the habit of doing, 10:25, and were growing weary and losing heart, 12:3. They were experiencing the reality that pain and perseverance are tough, but we are not expected to, nor should we, endure them alone. In last week's message, Simon explored the concept of suffering. There are levels of suffering, of course, and maybe you found yourself comparing your suffering to someone else's. Like that time when you were really upset about something that was important to you, and someone else was grieving a significant loss, and you felt bad for feeling bad. There's always someone worse off, but your pain is still legitimate. Sometimes, though, struggle and pain are good for us. I want to be sensitive here. Pain can make us stronger, but I'm not going to use that to counsel someone in deep grief, as Simon also mentioned last week. But let's consider some small examples of how struggle and pain can be beneficial before we continue with today's reading. Who's been to the gym and not felt pain and exhaustion afterwards? If you have, you're not doing it right. We go to the gym to cause our muscles pain so that they and our heart and lungs grow stronger to give us a healthier life, so I'm told. And what is the worst thing you can do for a chick that is hatching from its eggshell or a butterfly emerging from a cocoon? Help them. The chick has been given everything it needs to break that shell by itself, including a little hammer in its beak and an air sac at the top of the egg. In the same way, opening its cocoon and emerging from it gives the butterfly the strength it needs to fly. I watch clips of these things on YouTube and it's neither attractive nor graceful, and it really looks like it could use a bit of assistance. We might think we're helping the chick or butterfly by cracking the shell or opening the cocoon, but we're not. We're potentially harming them. For us, the effort, the toil, the pain, the blood, sweat, and tears of overcoming challenges can make us stronger. If we take God at His word, we will see it in our lives. He doesn't give up on us, ever. But He doesn't always step in to prevent the challenges, to break the shell or open the cocoon. We might call it tough love, but it's real love. Returning to our passage in Hebrews 13, the writer has finished the sermon and in the preceding chapters, and mentioned several practical things for his audience to attend to: hospitality, prison fellowship, honouring marriage, staying strong, and imitating their leaders. We'll return to those later, but the verse we're focusing on today is verse 5. Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. Forsake means to abandon or leave. This promise refers to a passage in Deuteronomy 31, but with a completely different context. In Deuteronomy 31, the promise is spoken by Moses, once to the whole assembly of Israel, and once in private to Joshua. Incidentally, Joshua and Jesus are essentially the same name. Joshua is the English translation of the Hebrew name of Jesus, Yeshua. Jesus is the English translation of the Greek Isus. It's no coincidence that they share a name. Both lead their people to victory and the fulfillment of God's promises. Joshua and the people were about to embark on a massive endeavour to claim the promised land and would have been naturally anxious about it. Knowing that God was with them would have been a huge encouragement. But let's look at the context of our verse in Hebrews 13:5. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. I don't know about you, but that doesn't seem anywhere near as significant as Joshua's situation. Material possessions, money, and contentment don't seem as momentous as international conquest. But as I said before, we shouldn't compare the contexts to judge the promise. Financial hardship is real. I've experienced it to a degree, but not the same as many people. Groceries, rent, and mortgage payments have put a huge strain on many people. The chance to own a home is available to fewer and fewer people. Meanwhile, the largest wealth gap in history is widening. The wealth of the world's, as you see on the screen, the wealth of the world's 5 richest billionaires has more than doubled since the start of this decade. That's 3 and a bit years. While 60% of humanity has grown poorer, 4.8 billion people are poorer than they were in 2019. That's from a report by Oxfam just last week. In Australia, people in the highest 20% of the wealth scale hold nearly 2/3 of all wealth, while those in the lowest 60% hold less than 1/5 of wealth, from ACOS just last year. Now, please understand, I'm not criticising wealthy people. By world comparative standards, I am wealthy. Wealth is another blessing of God. But it is our attitude towards money that is the issue, what we do with it. The writer of Hebrews does not specify whether his audience is poor or wealthy, but he does want them to be free of the love of money. The various contexts indicate that the promise is not situational, it's unconditional. If we are concerned about our financial situation, we're not being materialistic, selfish, or shallow. We should be responsible for our finances. What the promise reminds us of is that God is with us and in control, no matter what things look like. I'll use 2 examples to illustrate the trustworthiness of the promise, one from my own life and the other from Jesus' death. They're in no way meant to be seen as comparable, but the promise was important in both. As I said, I'm 40 years a follower of Jesus, but about 25 years ago, I was doubting my relationship with God. I'd gone through divorce and was living alone. I can be antisocial and enjoy my alone time, but this was different. I didn't feel alone, I felt deep loneliness. Separation from people and God. In my mind, I was punishing myself for my failed marriage when I knew Jesus had been the substitute for my punishment and his work was more than sufficient for my forgiveness. I hadn't been going to church, but it was this promise that caused me to start attending one. I will never leave you nor forsake you, echoing in my thoughts. In a kind of, okay, we'll see way, I started attending church and the path of my life changed. It was the promise that started me on that path which has led to the blessed life and relationships I have now, especially with Jesus, whose example is to mine like international conquest is to worry about money. Imagine it. It was about 3 p.m. on that first Friday. The Lord who had created mankind was being mocked by them as he hung upon a cross, nails piercing his hands and feet and his body racked with pain. People called him cursed and forsaken of God, and the darkness that surrounded him may have made him feel that way too. Indeed, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I cannot imagine the anguish the Lord felt at that time. Physical torture, the rejection of those he came to save, and worst, separation from the Father as he became sin for us. The darkness was a symbol of that loneliness. But the promise was his too, of course. Rising on the 3rd day and his ascension to be with the Father is proof that the promise was kept. It was the fulfillment of the promise that had been made hundreds of years earlier in Psalm 91. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. He will call on me and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. Later, Jesus conferred the promise onto all of us all of his disciples down to us. Surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. I will never leave you nor forsake you. The applications for this promise in the Bible include international conquest and concern for material things, but the one I will focus on now is neither of those. You may have noticed a theme running through my examples. The Israelites were alone against all the tribes arrayed against them: the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. As their leader, Joshua was alone with the responsibility of the conquest's success or failure. I was alone when I chose to separate myself from God and his people. Jesus was totally alone on the cross when he saved humanity, although people were around him. You know what? It's not being alone that is the problem for us. I've been called a troglodyte, an antisocial, for enjoying my own company. Those of us who are introverts need that time alone. It's therapeutic and revitalizing. No, the problem is loneliness, a very different beast. Living alone might cause the feeling, but we can feel lonely in the company of others too. No one here knows me. I'm different. Or they have no idea who I am after all this time, can leave us feeling lonely. It is for these people, the lonely, for whom the promise is very applicable. Loneliness is a growing epidemic in our society. A very quick search of the web indicates a cause for concern. Loneliness has been linked to premature death, poor physical and mental health, greater psychological distress, and general dissatisfaction with life. Young adults aged 18 to 25 years and adults over 65 years are more at risk of experiencing loneliness or social isolation and the associated negative health outcomes, from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare just last year again. I find the first group of people surprising, young people. The changes that occur in a young person's life around that age can exacerbate the feeling of loneliness. Changing from a peer group they grew up with at school to a big wide world of work or tertiary education, focus on finding a partner or someone who knows and understands them, a need to exert independence. I'm not a psychologist, but I remember my time as a young person, just. So young and old, and everyone in between, can feel loneliness and be adversely affected by it. I'm seeing loneliness in someone close to me now. My parents have lived together for more than 60 years, and just last year, Mum had to be moved to an aged care facility. Dad had cared for her at home as much and for as long as he could. Now he lives in a house that has part of its soul removed and intensely feels Mum's absence. He still sees her often, but of course it's not the same. This kind of loneliness is amplified by the more frequent news of the passing of family and friends of many decades. It is not something that I had thought about much before, but it is a growing issue in our community as our population continues to age. I hope that I can assuage, at least to some extent, Dad's loneliness, and as a family we're looking at ways to do that. For those experiencing loneliness, the promise that I will never leave you nor forsake you can give solace and encouragement. In response to the promise, prayer is the human action that shows that the promise is real to us and brings a sense of God's presence and joy. But saying that can seem trite, a panacea that only goes part way towards helping people who are experiencing challenges. It's true, of course, and a great encouragement that I have experienced myself, just as the psalmist said, that God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. There's more to it though. We collaborate with God, and his desire is that his will be done on earth as in heaven, which brings us back to the practical exhortations at the beginning of our passage in Hebrews 13. So let's tie what we've heard so far together before getting to those. We will find ourselves facing challenges of various kinds, ones that we struggle to deal with. As Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. It's a promise. God does not promise that we won't, but those struggles will make us stronger. He does promise, I will never leave you nor forsake you. The promise applies in all circumstances. Never means never. From great endeavours to leadership, to concerns about material possessions, to loneliness and others, the promise holds. The writer of the book of Hebrews has explained through numerous examples the fulfillment of God's promises to mankind through his Son Jesus. It's never enough that these truths should remain theoretical or theological. They have their human fulfillment in the actions of his people. As Micah reminds us, the Lord doesn't require sacrifice or knowledge. He requires action. Act justly and love mercy and walk humbly with your God. Act, love, walk with God. So what can we do to be Jesus in this world? In a professional meeting, there is usually a list of action points that come from it and are recorded in the minutes. Things that people are to do when they leave the meeting. In our passage, the exhortations are also practical. To love one another as brothers and sisters. To show hospitality to strangers. To remember those in prison. And honour marriage. The focus verse today also infers another action point. Trust God that he is in control of our financial well-being too. All these things are the practical antidotes for loneliness, community, outreach, empathy, family, security. These are our action points. Simple but profoundly important. Each one requires at least another sermon to cover. Thankfully for you, I will leave that for now. So in conclusion, whatever challenges you face, whatever you have done or not done, you can be assured that God will never leave you nor forsake you. He is an ever-present help in times of trouble. He is with you until the end of the age. And I will conclude with this. Remain constant in your faith. Do not get discouraged when the burdens you carry become heavy. Trust even when you cannot see the end of your trials. Be certain that he has not forgotten you, for he knows you so well that he even counts each hair on your head. Never will he leave or abandon you, for his promises and his mercy endures forever. Amen.